So hello and welcome to this media briefing on what to expect from the upcoming G7 Climate, Environment and Energy Ministerial meetings. We have three experts lined up to talk about the issues in play and what a good outcome would look like. The running order is we will start with Luca Bergamaschi, co-founding director of ECCO, Italy's leading climate change think tank, and possibly only climate change think tank. Luca will give an overview of the significance of the moment and the latest intel from the Italian G7 presidency. He's calling from a train, so bear with him if there are any connection issues. Maria Pastukova is an energy transition expert at E3G. She will give a status update on the progress of power sector decarbonisation across the G7. She will speak to the energy security concerns and the importance of mobilising finance for the clean energy transition in developing countries. And then we will have Faruk Ullah from IISD, who will address the need to phase out fossil fuel production in line with the COP28 outcome and the looming 2025 deadline for eliminating fossil fuel subsidies. Are G7 countries on track to meet it? Spoiler alert, no. So we have set aside an hour for this call and we'll try to keep the opening remarks brief to leave plenty of time for questions. You can type questions into the chat at any time, or you can raise your hand to speak after our experts have finished. So over to you, Luca.
Great, thank you, Megan, and thank you, IISD, for organizing this media briefing and inviting me. Sorry, I'm on a train to Turin, in fact, and if there is background noise or the connection goes, it's my fault. And please, Megan, let me know if that doesn't work. So we get in Turin now, basically 4 months after the COP28 outcome and the GST tax adopted by all countries. And this is really the first political moment, and I would say decision-making moment after COP, where the G7 really have the opportunity to make new commitments and tell the world how they are going to implement the COP28 outcome, and in particular how they're going to transition away from fossil fuels to renewable and doubling energy efficiency. So it will be very interesting to hear, to see the interest for scaling up investment in grids and also potentially a new target on batteries and energy storage. So this is all things that we look out for. But we also know that this moment is the first of two other more important meetings on the G7. At the end of May, the G7 finance minister will meet again in Italy to discuss finance, and we know how important it is, finance, and then in mid-June leaders. So there will be in the next 3 months, really, there will be the 3 months of the G7 this year. And the G7 really also kickstarts what we call the road to Belém, so towards COP30. And there's finance this year at COP29, so the new finance presents a new NDC, so National Determined Contribution. So what we will look for and what countries are discussing, G7 countries are discussing, is how do NDCs look like? What is, what does it mean aligning NDCs to 1.5? And we will look for clear indication on how NDCs should be developed. But also how G7 countries will support other countries in developing new NDCs. And of course, it is linked to the question of finance, because we know the developing country, the gap in investment in developing countries is huge. And what we also would need to see, and this is more difficult, is a signal on finance and recognizing the needs of developing country. And particularly, we heard yesterday, for example, the German foreign minister, the Petersberg dialogue, pointing to the clear trillions needs, and particularly 1 trillion per year, she mentioned, on the need that needs to be mobilized by everybody. Of course, the G7, they don't want to prejudge the outcome of the COP29, because everyone needs to respect the process, that everyone needs to come together and agree our goal collectively. But pointing to these needs will be very important. So this is something we will look out for. On energy, I'm sure Maria will tell much more. I also just want to mention the issue of coal. As you might know, coal is a very hot topic in the G7, mostly because we have one country, Japan, that is a little bit behind everyone else. And it will be interesting to see how G7 collectively, whether, for example, there will be a date for domestic coal phase out. This is like a big ask. We know that 2030 is a science-aligned date that we need for G7. Let's see how far G7 will go. And I just wanted to point to the PPCA statement, and perhaps we can share it here in the chat or later, that came out yesterday. And the PPCA, the Power and Past Coal Alliance, is the coalition of the most advanced country on coal out, and as you know, COP28, the US joined the PPCA, which now make the PPCA is really or the G6, but Japan are part of the PPCA. So this is a really good, strong indication of what we would like to see. And the PPCA put out a statement that ideally, if a lot of it would be endorsed by the G7, would be a massive step forward. So I'll stop here for now, and thank you again, everybody. Wonderful.
All right, thank you, Luca. We had a little bit of interference in the middle of the call there, but I think we got the gist of what you were saying. And if there's anything that needs clarifying, I'm sure it will come up in the questions. So I'm going to move now to Maria.
Thanks, Megan, and great to see everybody in the room. Just very quickly to go through the energy expectations of the G7. It is quite clear, as Luke already said, that after the global energy targets had been agreed at COP28 last year, the G7 now must spearhead the delivery, and all eyes, both from vulnerable countries, but more generally speaking about global South, are really on this group of the richest economies to show that the delivery is possible and is benefiting economies. And the G7 really needs to be doing that in three ways. One of them is by clearly communicating steps they are taking domestically on some key issues, which have been an issue of debate for the group for a long time. One, Luca has mentioned already, is the domestic coal phase out. Coal is on the downward trajectory in the G7 for several years now, and the group's commitment to a 2030 phase out of coal use is in line with IEA's net zero emissions scenario, is in line with the 1.5 degrees trajectory, and is long overdue. This commitment has been on the table of the energy ministers, of the negotiators of the Ministerial for several years now, but has repeatedly failed to find its way into the communique, with Japan being famous for continuously pushing back on this. But now that the US has joined the PPCA and there is this new push to really show strong delivery, there is a strong expectation, of course, that G7 finally manages to put this target of 2030 phase out of unabated, at least, coal use and no new coal commitment on the agenda. The second bit, to which G7 as a group has committed for several years now, is the domestic power systems decarbonization. In 2021, the group has said that they will reach net zero power systems, with some caveats, but by 2035. And since then, we haven't seen any show of progress or any clear steps by the countries communicated towards this target. And it is quite clear that this commitment, first of all, needs to be rated of the existing caveats. It's not predominantly, it's a fully decarbonized power sector that we need to have by 2035, and commit to come up with national pathways towards this target, because it is not enough to reiterate the commitment anymore. Now that we're talking delivery, we really need to see that countries come forward with concrete plans for how they're doing to achieve that and what their net zero mix will be looking like by 2035. We've been looking into the power systems of these countries throughout the last year, and we'll come out with a scorecard of the G7 power systems soon. And the high-level outcomes of that scorecard is that though some countries are taking significant steps towards a decarbonized power sector, significant delivery risks remain, in particular in area of gas. Japan is, of course, a laggard throughout the whole board on coal and gas, on renewables build out, but gas is an issue in all G7 countries, and none of them is thinking about the clear trajectory of gas demand reduction. What will it look like to phase out unabated gas by 2035? There is no conversation about that so far, so we are expecting some progress in this. Last but not least, in terms of domestic delivery, the G7 have spearheaded the the progress on methane emissions reduction a couple of years ago with the emergence of global methane pledge, but now they need to go beyond that and really to look at their own energy sectors. What we expect them to do is to commit to at least 75% emissions reduction in oil and gas sector and ban all non-emergency flaring and venting as soon as possible. According to the International Energy Agency, these are the banning flaring and venting is the most efficient, the most cost-effective means of reducing methane emissions that comes either at net zero or even at a benefit to those countries because you get to use the methane you save up. The second part of what G7 need to do, and we have not seen that for 2 years, is to finally snap out of the crisis mode in which they have been since Russia's invasion into Ukraine. And from that came the very kind of unbalanced focus on gas and on new gas investments. Obviously, European countries in particular had to eliminate the dependency on Russia's gas exports as soon as possible. But now that we're heading not only in an oversupplied market of LNG, and I don't know if you have seen this report, but last week, Acer came forward with the new data showing that EU's LNG imports are nearing its peak. And at the same time, the gas market in those countries within the G7 that are importing gas is already overcontracted. That is, there are more long-term contracts than the EU will need within the trajectories of their own gas demand reduction. Now, there is really tight time to exit this crisis mode and drop that unnecessary and harmful language of Germany's and Japan's ministerial we had over the past 2 years on the need for new gas investments. Even in Japan's case, a country that has peaked its gas demand 10 years ago already, but still pushing for new gas investments, there is just no case for it. At least you can't justify it for security reasons. Finally, in the context of the COP outcomes, and that's something Luke already touched upon, and ahead of the COP29, which is the finance COP, we really need the G7 to come forward with a set of concrete and time-bound steps to support and facilitate just and equitable transition in emerging markets and developing economies. And this really must go this time beyond that superficial language of technical assistance and exchanging best practices, because that we have already heard over several years. G7 have proposed some mechanisms to speed up the global delivery, including the Clean Energy Economy Action Plan they came forward with last year. We very much hope and we expect the G7 to show in this ministerial communique and later in the leaders how they plan to use this plan and other mechanisms that they have at their disposal to enable deployment of clean energy solutions, as well as clean energy-based value chains to support economic development in emerging markets and developing economies. I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Maria. That's covered a lot of ground. We will move now to Farouk. Farouk, go ahead.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today. Building on Luca and Maria, to operationalize the outcomes of COP28, G7 governments must really commit to this principle of no new oil and gas production and development. The science is very clear that there's no room for new fossil fuels under a 1.5 C degree pathway. And oil and gas producers in the G7, specifically the US, Canada, and the UK, need to stop issuing new oil and gas licenses as an urgent first step and end financing for production internationally and domestically. But we aren't seeing this yet. The US alone is responsible for more than a third of planned expansion of oil and gas production globally between 2050, according to Oil Change International. As Luca said, a strong signal from this G7 on finance is now crucial to making sure that we can move forward on our climate challenges this decade and beyond. Aligning finance with this transition is key. However, the G7 is still wasting billions of dollars propping up fossil fuel industries. Ultimately, this money is desperately needed for sustainable development, including scaling up of renewables, as Maria alluded to. The G7, as we all know, set 2025 as its deadline for eliminating inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. It's very clear that it's not going to meet that target. Indeed, in 2022 alone, during the peak of the energy crisis, fossil fuel subsidies have hit an all-time high of $1.529 trillion US dollars, according to IISD and OECD's fossil fuel subsidy tracker. In 2022, the G7 specifically provided $199 billion in subsidies for fossil fuels, While most of these subsidies were directed towards consumers, around 153 billion, a substantial amount were given to support production of fossil fuels, about 42 billion. Much of the academic research around production subsidies for fossil fuels shows that this money goes directly to the sort of bottom line or the profit margins of these companies, and really hasn't have a big effect on affecting production prices. In 2022, the G7 also still provided international public finance for fossil fuels around the tune of $22 billion, whereas the G7 countries only provided $97 billion to clean energy via international mechanisms. So there is obviously a disproportionality between the support that's going for these industries, and the money needs to come out of the fossil industry and into the clean column. But one obstacle to progress has been the lack of a definition of what inefficient means in this 2025 commitment. We expect to see some clarification on this from this G7 to narrowing it down to subsidies that do not address energy poverty and just transition. However, the G7 must go beyond the decisions made at COP28 and express greater ambition through clarity. A common definition on what we mean by inefficient subsidies will be helpful. But given the 2025 deadline, this will probably be too little too late, with only 1 year to go to the deadline. Therefore, if a common definition is to be agreed, it must be done so immediately within this year. Furthermore, G7 countries now need to urgently create roadmaps to tackle these persistent subsidies before the 2025 and by the 2025 deadline. However, a priority has to be on eliminating subsidies to producers. We can't afford to expand oil and gas production under the 1.5C budget. We also would like to, and hope to see in the G7 communique recognition of the link between rising cost of energy and a recent spike in subsidies and government support. With ongoing conflicts around the world, and particularly the Middle East, this raises the prospect of further and new oil and gas price volatility. And G7 ministers therefore need to make sure that any crisis support mechanisms support people, not fuels. In summary, with 1 year to go to the deadline for eliminating inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, G7 countries are way off track. G7 countries urgently need to create national roadmaps to urgently tackle persistent support to coal, oil, and gas. Ending production subsidies is the priority for G7 and all other governments. And any crisis measures brought in to shield consumers from fossil inflation, that is, inflation driven by fossil fuel, should be time-bound, transparent, and targeted. Thank you.
Thank you, Farouk. So we'll now open it up to questions. I think there's quite a lot to chew over there. So if you would like to ask a question, please raise a hand, and let me just pin Luca and Maria to put you in the spotlight. Oh, no, I was trying to add you both as spotlights while you're thinking about your questions. Let me do that. Add spotlight. There we go. Who would like to ask a question? I can probably think of one. Don't tell me this group of journalists cannot think of any questions. Anyone? Okay. We have a question in the chat. Matteo, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. I couldn't find any way to raise the hand. Sorry. My question is about the fossil fuel subsidies, actually. Has there been any attempt at all to define the inefficient part of the subsidies? Within the G7 group, are there particular countries that kind of push for a stronger ambition on it, and other countries that kind of hold back that, or are all countries sort of aligned on the same level?
Okay, thank you. And Ella Ide has asked a similar question in the chat, so I'll push that one back to you, Farouk.
Thank you, Megan, and thanks both for the question. I think there probably is broad consensus amongst the G7. The challenge is that they will probably just essentially repeat the language coming out of COP28 relating to the GST outcomes, the global stocktake outcomes related on fossil fuel subsidies, which produces these definitions to the qualifier and efficient around energy poverty and the just transition, which are justifiable and therefore are considered efficient fossil fuel subsidies. But what we really mean by inefficient is still not necessarily clear. So yes, to answer Ella's question, I think we expect to see some definition on inefficient, but it will probably just be a repeat of the language that was introduced at COP28, which was very much driven by the EU. And I think there is broad consensus in the G7 about that. What we would like to see is further ambition about clarity of this. And again, not just providing the exceptions to the qualifier, but actually defining what really is inefficient.
Okay, I hope that answers your question. For anyone wondering how to raise your hand, if you look under the menu on reactions, there's a little raise hand command, or you can, of course, still type questions into the chat. So anyone else? Any more? Sarah.
Hi, I just have I guess a logistical question. I think the meeting is supposed to end on the 30th of April. Is that the day that we would expect some kind of a communique or a summation of the meetings?
Luca?
Yes, so the press conference is scheduled between 2:30 and 3 o'clock at Central European Time. And this is when we expect also the communique to come out. If negotiators close the communique by Sunday, so before the minister come, it could be that there is a leak, or the presidency decide that already on Monday to publish it. It's unlikely, but if there is strong consensus and countries feel very confident that it's the final text, that could also be the case. But I would mark the calendar for, let's say, 2:30, 2:30, 3 o'clock on Tuesday, and also tune in for the press conference, and hopefully there will be a live stream. If not, journalists on the ground will be able to follow.
And are there any particularly contentious issues between countries that you anticipate could hold up in the communique? I know this was the case with Japan in recent years. So
yes, so coal is definitely on top of the contentious issues, and that also could be something that goes to ministers to discuss. And so this is definitely around the coal phase out date. It's something that we expect to occupy the agenda for the next couple of days. But again, Japan is quite isolated, and the PPCA statement provides the way forward. The question is how much of the statement can Japan accept, and would help also Japan implement then the commitment on, because risk of that Japan, even if Japan agree at 2030, is given how much of coal capacity is still in Japan, there will be very little time to meet. So there should be compromise around around leaving enough time to Japan to adjust. And also at the end of the year, the Japanese government will present a new energy policy review that should ideally set out how Japan also will meet the target of 2035 of decarbonizing the power sector by 2035, as was agreed over the last 2 years in the G7. So I think it's very interesting from Japan. But again, if we see a date post 2030, this is not a backsliding from the G6, but it's something that helped accommodate Japan. And also be reminded that most of the G6 countries, they already have coal phase-out date at national level. So if you take Italy, it's 2025. If you take Germany, they said by 2030. If you take the UK, is already gone. And France, I don't remember exactly France, but it's before 2030. So, you know, it's balance to be found between Japan and the rest of the G6. G7, sorry.
Okay, so we've got another written question in the chat. Could anyone speak to the potential initiatives on batteries or energy storage? Maria, is that something you're across? Yeah.
Sure, I'm happy to. This from what we see is likely a beginning of a process we had on tripling renewables, doubling efficiency last year, when the targets have been noted by the G7 in their ministerial, and then they made all the way up to COP28 to be adopted as official global targets. It is quite clear that storage, batteries, and grids, I would add to that, are key elements of delivery, enabling tripling renewables and doubling efficiency targets globally. So the next logical step would be to understand, so how much storage do we need to build up globally? How much investment needs to go in grids? And within storage, how much needs to be batteries and versus long-term storage? And what we expect this year likely is the G7 just noting these targets. They have been put forward by the IEA already. I believe it's something about 1.5 terawatt storage capacity by 2030 that needs to be there. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's what the IEA said. Doubling investments in grids, focusing both on transmission and smaller scale grids and distribution systems. So there are several numbers that G7 can really note and say that they are critical, and that would be very helpful in order to kick off that diplomacy rhythm into the G20, into UNGA, and then into COP to make it a global target.
Okay, great. Thank you, Maria. And we've got another question from Matteo from Climate Home News. Do you expect any significant signals or language on climate finance in the communique, or will that be left to the finance ministers and the leaders' summits? Luca, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, happy to. Ideally, yes, but at the moment it's really difficult. So we don't expect a strong signal coming from it. Of course, there will be lots of language setting out how the G7 will support and mobilize, support developing country reaching the mitigation adaptation targets. And in particular, I think on adaptation there is something very interesting that the Italian presidency is working to support partnership, building resilience, and support, basically translating adaptation plans into investment plans, which I think is very interesting. So there might be an initiative on that. But more generally, I think at the moment we don't see many numbers, and this is a little bit of a problem. And ideally, what we need to see is a recognition of the needs of the trillion, as I mentioned before, even if it is referring the text of the GST on that. So I think paragraph 67 and 66, if I remember well, talk about the trillion gaps on both mitigation and adaptation finance, and recognizing that would be very important. For example, an important reference is the work of the independent expert group on climate finance that was chaired by Lord Stern and Vera Sangberg. And that was produced in December 2022. So we are almost 2 years from basically knowing the trillion's needs. And I think G7 needs at least to recognize the gap. And that doesn't mean that it prejudge in any way the SCQG outcome at COP29, because again, this is a conversation in certain low countries, and and the goals it's a bottom-up process of negotiation that will happen in Baku. But again, it's that maybe with reference to those external, well, external report or the GST would be very strong. So, but at the moment we don't see it, and to be honest, we don't also see finance minister enough caring about the climate finance. Yes, there is a recognition that needs to be done, but there is really no willingness to increase the pot, and this is a huge problem. This is why, for me, the climate finance could and should be the most important item that leaders address in mid-June when they meet, because it's only them that can give a mandate to both finance minister and climate minister to work together to mobilize the necessary finance through many ways. So there is a reform of the multilateral bank, as Farouk said. There is a domestic mobilization to rethinking and reviewing how we spend public money towards subsidies. There is new innovative mechanisms such as international taxation. There are levies of various types on maritime transport, on other issues. So there are ways. The question is there the political will? At the moment, finance ministers are not willing to go there. Will leaders unblock that? I think that's a big question. Thank you.
Okay, so if you're looking for the most contentious issue, it's coal phase out dates. But if you're looking for the most important issue, it is the glaring lack of political will on climate finance, perhaps. Okay, are there any more questions from anyone? Okay, I don't see any more hands, so thank you for joining us and asking questions. I hope you found it useful, and yeah, we'll be in touch with comments on the outcome in due course. And yeah, stay in touch. Thank you.